Alright, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scope into my puppet, then into its logic, and open up the poses microchip. In here, I'm going to be deleting this pose right here because I'm not going to need it since we'll be making a custom run animation. And to make things easier for myself, I'm going to relabel this microchip as run. Now with everything set up, I can then put down a timeline to begin making my animation. And I will do that entirely with keyframes. I'm making sure that the puppet mirror tool is also active, that way the puppet stays centered above the base at all times. The reason I want to do this is because I want to create a symmetrical animation, so having the body be centered will help with that. And as you can see, if I have it turned off, it can be very easy to start skewing the pose. For this animation, I'm going to be using the poses I have drawn and put down in the description as a reference. Of course, you can animate however you'd like, I just find this is a simple enough reference to follow with a very few amount of keyframes. Currently, you'll notice that I am struggling to animate the legs, and the reason for that is because, for some reason, when you start moving around the hips, it will then lock the feet into place if they have not been animated yet. A simple way to fix this is by hovering over each foot and de-animating it by pressing triangle. For the limbs, I'm making sure to turn off the puppet mirror tool because I do not want both legs moving simultaneously, but I will turn it back on to be able to adjust the body, the neck, and the head because I do want those to still be centered. For my first pose, I want the heel to be making contact with the ground, so I'm making sure to move around the leg and the foot until contact has been made. For now, I am just adjusting the pose into something that I can be happy with. As like it is making an animation anywhere else, it's important to take your time and to have patience to make sure that the animation can reach its full potential. And once I am finally happy with the pose I have created, I can then copy the keyframe to begin working on the second pose. And just like the first pose, I am going to continue to follow my reference to make sure that the run looks as it should. For now, I am going to just speed along because the entire process for making the rest of the poses is the exact same as the first pose, of course with just different poses based on the reference. And to give you an idea of how long this whole thing would take, this video right here, without any editing, would take approximately 15 minutes long. Overall, it doesn't take very long to make a run animation, especially once you've gained some practice and do it more frequently. And to be honest, this whole process would be even shorter than that if you were not trying to make a tutorial video. So now that my poses are all done, I can now link those poses together to see what the animation itself looks like in motion. Now I will hover my imp in between each of the keyframes and press L1 and X to blend them together. Now if I just move the playhead, I can see how the run looks so far. And I can also see any adjustments that I need to make and adjust them accordingly. For example, I am noticing that the foot is clipping through the ground, so to fix this I am just going to raise the leg a little bit higher. After that is finished, I can begin making my second set of keyframes by duplicating the first one. And I will just change the color real quick to make things easier to follow. The second set of keyframes is that the second foot can also make contact with the ground and form a perfect loop. So I'm going to edit that keyframe and turn on the puppet mirror tool and duplicate exactly one side of the puppet. In this case, the right arm and the right leg will be copied, and then I will de-animate just the right side only. So now, the right half of the puppet's pose is now duplicated over to the left. Next, I am going to be copying the first pose again, and then I'm going to be doing the opposite. In this case, I'm going to select the left half of the puppet's limbs and duplicate that over to the right side, and then de-animate everything on the left side as well. To make the two poses into one, I'm going to line up the two keyframes together. And because they are lined up, you can now see that the previously de-animated limbs from the first keyframe match up with the second keyframe's animated limbs. So essentially what this does is it lets me combine the two frames into one. And because the two keyframes are stacked on top of each other, the de-animated limbs then take the pose of the other keyframe. Then you can just carefully grab the de-animated limbs and just move them very slightly to then lock them into place, at which point you will have a perfectly mirrored pose. So I am going to now repeat this process for every single one of my original keyframes to then make a second set of them that are perfectly mirrored to the first ones. So in total, it'll take about 8 unique poses to create this run animation, a lot less than the previous run tutorial. So with everything now done, I can go through the playhead and see how the animation looks all together. Currently it's a little bit slow, but that's something that's very easy to fix, and we will do that very shortly. But first, if we hit play with the right thumbstick, we can see that the animation doesn't look quite right while in play mode. The reason for this is it is trying to do the procedural run while doing the custom run, so we can just quickly turn that off. And as a personal preference, I'm also going to be disabling the motion sensor movement to make the head stay in place based on how I animated it. I'll also disable the auto look, and now I can see that the animation looks as I intended it to, but as I said before, it is too slow. So the way I'm going to fix that is I'm going to scoop the keyframes closer together, making sure that they're evenly spaced out so that way the animation loops very nicely and it doesn't linger on any particular pose. So for now I'm just going to continue placing all the keyframes where they will go, and once I am done with that, I'm then going to edit the timeline into a loop. The reason I'm going to do this is because I want it to be a run cycle that continues endlessly when you're running. So now that it's looped, I can then just lower the timeline, and you can see now that it loops kind of okay. The reason for that is because the final keyframe doesn't match the first keyframe, so I can just duplicate the first keyframe to the end, and now when I loop it, it loops seamlessly. Now personally, I feel like this is still too slow, so I'm going to open the timeline tweak menu and use the playback speed to adjust the overall speed of my run. So of course I can then speed it up or slow it down depending on what I personally feel like doing, and in this case I feel like not maxing it out maybe, but just going a little bit faster than normal. And at this point the run is done, so all I have to do now is just set up the logic for it so that it is not constantly in motion. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to be using the left stick from the controller sensor, as well as a few extra gadgets, which will be an AND gate, a calculator, and a value slider. So basically, I'm having it so that the AND gate will power the timeline, and the calculator as well as an on-ground sensor will power the AND gate. Essentially, what I want it to be is, I want it to be that when the player pushes the stick a certain amount, it'll begin doing the run. So I can put down this value slider, and I can simply have it so that the left stick goes directly into it. And if I just quickly go into test mode, we can see that depending on how hard I push the stick, it then puts out an output corresponding to my pressure. In this case, half pressure puts it at about 0.5, while full pressure puts it at a solid 1. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to have the value go into the A input on the calculator. And I'm going to have it so that basically when that value is greater than about 0.6 in this case, it will then output a signal. And that will go right into the AND gate as well as the on-ground sensor. So now, whenever I push the stick a certain amount while touching the ground, my puppet will then do its run animation. It's a little bit slidey right now, so I'm just going to quickly go in and adjust some of the values here. I'm going to raise the acceleration and the deceleration, as well as change the overall turn speed. With all of that out of the way now, I can go back and I can begin testing the run yet again. So as previously stated, depending on how hard I push the stick while touching the ground, it'll begin running. Of course, if I don't put enough pressure on the stick, it will deactivate the run, at which point I can then set it up to walk. So now, just to see what it would look like without this logic, if I just had it so that the left stick directly powered the timeline, we would see that it would constantly be going off, and even trying to walk just wouldn't come out quite right because trying to do the run. And while being in the air, it would also continue to try to run because I was holding the left stick. So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to have it so that the walk is actually procedural, but the run itself still would not be. So the way I can do that is I can put down a keyframe that will turn back on the procedural animations. Of course, you can also make your own custom walk cycle, which would then use a different reference, but overall be the same in terms of logic. The difference being that you would need 2 extra calculators. One would be set to be less than the one for the run cycle, and another one that simply is set to greater than 0. So essentially what that does is it says if you are pushing the stick a little bit, but still less than it would take to run, it would then activate the walk cycle. And of course it would deactivate when you were not moving. But now we can see that depending on how hard I push the stick, it'll either do the procedural walk or my custom run animation. Now you'll notice that there is no sound effects for the footsteps, so I can just open up my timeline and I can put down the sound effects for footsteps. I'm also going to make it a little bit shorter because it doesn't need to be this long, and I'm just going to have it so that when the foot makes contact to the ground, it will then activate the sound as well. So now we can see that when we play the animation, whenever a foot makes contact with the ground, it plays a sound. So now you should have a completed run cycle as well as all the logic perfectly set up for your next game. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you're having a good old time. The game just released yesterday and it has been so much fun so far, and I know it'll continue to be. So, in the meantime, Wherever you are, I hope that you're having sweet dreams.